In Rogue Legacy, you play as a family of knights determined to challenge Castle Hampson and discover its secrets and treasures within. Rogue Legacy is a simple 2D side-scroller with a progression system that requires you to die. After a death, you're given a few choices of Descendants to take over and continue the quest to find out what's inside Castle Hampson. Any accumulated gold from your last character is inherited by your Descendant and can be used to enhance your estate, increasing your statistics for all subsequent characters or unlocking new classes, and to purchase equipment and upgrades from the blacksmith and enchantress. Any unspent gold is simply taken by Charon every time you re-enter Castle Hampson, so it's advisable to spend it all. Blacksmith upgrades largely function as economical stat boosts, but also require finding a blueprint inside the castle. An upgrade to your sword is significantly less gold investment than the equivalent in upgrading attack power in your estate. The better gear is heavier, which requires additional stat investment, so it's not all wine and roses. A significant portion of the gear has unique effects like vampirism, which heals you when you defeat enemies, or returning 50% of the damage you take to an enemy. Gear also plays into your character classes, as certain gear is much more suited to certain class archetypes. The Enchantress's runes can provide unique bonuses like adding additional air jumps or dashing. These runes can be a fun way to add customization because you can have things like 5 mid-air jumps, which is really satisfying. The runes do provide a nice bit of customization, and being able to swap things around to meet your needs is a great feature. The final NPC in Rogue Legacy is the Architect. He allows you to lock down the layout of the castle at the expense of 40% of your gold earnings. Utilizing the Architect's services is the easiest way to beat Rogue Legacy, as it makes subsequent attempts on bosses significantly faster, as you no longer have to hunt them down. After you lock down the layout of the castle, you can simply teleport to the boss and do an attempt. The 40% take of the Architect means that this is really the only use for him. Losing out a significant chunk of your gold gains when the whole premise of the game is gathering gold to upgrade your characters makes it difficult to justify his use. The game is very simple otherwise. You goose step around, jump, swing your sword, and use the occasional spell. You search for the 4 bosses inside the castle, and eventually find out what's so special about it. An interesting aspect of Rogue Legacy is that all your Descendants you can choose from usually have some quirks, to say the least. They can be good, such as having PAD, which prevents spike traps from triggering, or they can be neutral, like Hypochondriac, which causes all the damage numbers your character takes to be 100 times higher than their original value, or they can be quite bad with things like Vertigo, which flips the screen vertically, or things like having your spells cast from behind you. It's a really mixed bag because the Descendants are all randomized. There may be only one of your preferred class, but they could have some crippling flaw that makes playing them a terrible choice. These traits on characters do add some variety both in gameplay and just aesthetics. It can be a nice change, but overall, except for the extremely negative ones, they mostly function as flavor rather than something meaningful. The classes as well add some flavor, but often there are some clear standouts. Any class that has high survivability, like the Barbarian King or Paladin, which is just the absolute baseline, is usually a safe bet. The Archmage is simply too fragile to have any real use, and with randomized spells, it can be terrible. The Ninja and Knave are both classes that favor physical attacking while being fragile, and are decent choices, mostly for boss attempts. Rogue Legacy's graphics are simple, but aesthetically pleasing. Enemies do kind of lack variety, however. Enemies in a family are all tiered, and they are usually just larger, significantly recolored versions of the enemies with a few variants to their basic attack structure. This also applies to bosses, where they really act as a final tier to the more common enemies in the game, which was a disappointing revelation. This applies to your characters. They all have tiny variances to their aesthetics and flavor. Baldness removes helmet plumes, female characters have bows, wizards all have beards regardless of gender, just some small things for variance. The soundtrack is decent. There is a song loop for each of the major areas of the castle and unique tracks for bosses in a few special areas. The soundtracks are fairly satisfying, but again, get repetitive quickly due to the nature of the game. The story is told mostly through the introductory exposition and the journal entries you find. There isn't a lot to keep you going, and most of the exposition is thrown at you right before the final boss. Rogue Legacy is mostly a numbers game. While you can bypass the progression system with your own skills, the game is built around you farming gold, dying, and then upgrading your next Descendants. As you slowly do more playthroughs, your characters progressively get stronger until you're eventually able to succeed. Your statistics in Rogue Legacy start off pathetic. You'll be dying in a few hits, which leads to a lot of really quick deaths after only clearing a few rooms. Castle Hampson is broken into tiers, with each wing of the castle being more difficult than the last. There's the castle, then the forest to the right, the Maya above, and the darkness below. Regardless of the randomized nature, the position of these areas always stays in that order. Rogue Legacy is designed mostly that you clear the bosses in the area's order, as each area represents a significant difficulty spike from the previous one. A lot of the difficulty is also dependent entirely on your luck with Offspring. Certain classes like Barbarian and Shinobi are simply better than things like Mage or Lich until the highest upgrade tiers, where things kind of balance out, mostly due to the capping out of raw statistics. This means it's actually a net benefit to forgo unlocking certain classes. If you skip unlocking something like the Lich, they'll never show up in your Offspring, and you can use that to increase your odds of classes with better survivability or damage dealing capabilities. A lot of rooms do feel borderline impossible to get through without getting hit. This, combined with the random element of just not being able to access certain challenges because of traits or inherent magic spells, can lead to a lot of unnecessary frustration, especially if you're trying to unlock everything. Rogue Legacy is built around and largely defined by the progression system. As a direct result of it, the majority of the time spent in your first playthrough is just running around scrounging for gold in an attempt to get a level up or two to increase your odds against a boss, until finally you manage to best them. Then repeat until the 4 area bosses are defeated and you can finish the playthrough. A completed playthrough with 169 children and a brief foray into New Game Plus was completed in 8 hours, 33 minutes, and 43 seconds. A previous playthrough at original release collecting all runes and equipment, maxing out the mana and entering New Game Plus took approximately 24 hours. An update has provided some additional bosses, which requires finding a specific orbital in the castle and beating them with a predefined character. The progression system can get quite monotonous. If you don't get enough gold for an upgrade with their ever-increasing prices, that attempt and time invested is just totally wasted. After the first 2 to 3 hours, this happens frequently. You're in the worst position possible because you're weak enough to easily be killed, but things cost a good chunk of gold, so an upgrade isn't guaranteed. After that initial hump, you can usually survive long enough to scrounge enough for at least one upgrade. This gameplay loop is simultaneously fun and not fun. It's satisfying to get a good run going. It feels really good to get back-to-back Charon's Obol so you can manage to barely scrape by a huge chunk of gold for some of the more lucrative upgrades. Then it can be infuriating if you're getting terrible luck and make no progress on multiple Descendants and time invested. After beating the final boss in Rogue Legacy, a second cycle starts immediately. This has higher level enemies, more lucrative treasure to collect, and better equipment and runes. Unfortunately, it follows the progression of the first cycle. You're very weak starting New Game Plus, and you won't be able to survive for very long. This leads to you scrounging more gold for more upgrades until finally you can survive long enough to hunt down the boss rooms and take them down. It's more of the same, and unless you're really enjoying it, can safely be skipped for virtually no detriment. There's a lot of content in Rogue Legacy, but it's a huge amount of repetition. One playthrough is probably enough for most players since nothing really meaningful changes in New Game Plus and onwards. Rogue Legacy will be a polarizing experience. Fans of roguelikes may be put off by the emphasis on success through defeat and the gameplay loop rather than their own knowledge and skill at the game. It feels almost impossible to succeed at Rogue Legacy without opting into the estate expansion system to level up your characters and unlock new classes. This really means Rogue Legacy is more a game built around grinding for stats rather than improving your actual skill at the game. You can bypass the progression system if you choose, but to do so would be like beating your head against a wall. At its core, it's simple and satisfying to get a good run going. The various traits of the Offspring can be fun, but they often barely have an effect on anything. If you're looking for a light action game with an emphasis on character building over time, Rogue Legacy may fit the bill, but it does have a large difficulty spike in the beginning that gradually tapers off as you upgrade your characters. This happens again in New Game Plus, where the increased difficulty of enemies does kind of put you back at square one. It's unfortunate that Rogue Legacy feels like a grinding simulator, because with a bit more balancing, it could have been something much more than what it is. Rogue Legacy isn't a bad game by any stretch of the imagination, but for being mostly built around grinding, Rogue Legacy just won't be for everyone. Rogue Legacy gets recommended playing's most disgraceful verdict of not recommended.